Okay.
The only person who wasn't thanked was Alan's daughter. He's always the man behind the scenes. As Alan mentioned, we're sponsoring the lecture tonight, Zecher Nishmas Abimari, memory of my father, Shimon ben Yitzchak Gershon, who was lifted the third night of Hanukkah, so the yard site was just finished a couple of hours ago. Shama should have Aliyah. We're so happy that my mother is here, and Faggy and Nachman and Sandy and a lot of the family, and we're very, very pleased with that. I just wanted to share with you, many people knew my father, and he was the kind of person that as soon as he would walk into a room and would see a face that wasn't familiar, he would make a beeline over to the person, stick his hand out, say Shalom Aleichem, and within about 3 minutes, he knew everything about the person, where he was born, where he lived, what he did for a living, and then began to play Jewish geography to see if somehow we were related or there was some connection. And it was just that kind of friendliness and warm greetings that he did on a regular, always. There's stories about him being on a plane, and then he develops a long-time friendship just by sitting beside someone. So I'd like to share with you one of those occurrences, which sticks out in my mind. He used to daven in the morning, sometimes at the Chevra Shas on Bathurst Street next to Chocolate Charm, and he would walk in. He walks in one morning, and he looks around and he sees a strange face, and so he walks over and he goes through the motion, Shalom Aleichem, where are you from? And it turns out that he was a doctor who was visiting from Israel, who was doing a 6-month sabbatical at Princess Margaret. He was a cancer doctor, specialized in bone marrow transplants, the head of the department in Hadassah in Keren. So my father says to him, so where are you staying? So he said, my wife and I rented an apartment, a basement apartment on Bakers. And he said, and I noticed that beside your tallis bag, there's another big bag. What's that big bag? So he said, well, after davening, I'm going over to the laundromat at Rainey and Bathurst to do my laundry. And so my father said to him, a doctor who is dealing with cancer and dealing with very important things shouldn't be doing laundry. So give me your laundry, I'll take it home, and my wife will do your laundry. It's a true story, right? And my mother did their laundry for 6 months, and that was that was his thing. It was like I have a chance to do a chesed for somebody, and people are sending their laundry over to my mother. And the upshot of that was that within a year or so, there were some issues where we had to consult with a cancer specialist, and he became someone who dealt with the family and with friends that we had who needed help. And then a year later, we're in Yerushalayim and we get invited to his kid's wedding. So it was like, out of nowhere, somebody that he meets, and it was that kind of openness and warmness that we were brought up with, where the home was open and it was always people coming and going, and nobody was a stranger. It was all Am Yisrael, it was all one people, and that's the way I remember my father. So I'm happy that you could listen to the story, and with that, we should hope that his neshama has an aliyah, and that the divrei Torah that are learned tonight will be Luas Nishmas.
There was this one. You have precise times? Precise. That was very nice. Thank you very much, David. May indeed the great Torah that we hear tonight be a schus for the neshama of Shimon ben Yitzchak Gershon. Now, what we're going to do tonight, we're going to start off with a study of a Mishnah. We're going to study a Mishnah. We're going to go through a complete Mishnah. It's important to remember that when we deal with yard sites, and there are many things we do, among the things we should keep in mind is the study of Mishnah. It's fundamental. This is what is taught in our tradition. So I'm going to start off with the Mishnah tonight. And I chose this Mishnah for one word. One word that's going to make its appearance, but you're going to have to tune in to the complete Mishnah. And here we go. The Mishnah is talking about kilayim. Kilayim. In this case, it is addressing the prohibition of mixing sheep's wool with flax, linen, shatnez. And the Mishnah tells us, "En osur mishum kilayim elat semer upishtim." In other words, don't think that the mixture of any two materials create a problem, but specifically, you have an issue of shatnez if you mix semer, sheep's wool, with pishtim, the linen, the flax. Number two, the Mishnah tells us, Eino mitameh b'negaim. In other words, we know that the Torah tells us that there are specific garments that somehow become impure with this concept of a blemish, a negaim. And the Mishnah tells us that that only applies to tsemer upishtim. Only if the garment is of sheep's wool or flax would there be such an issue. Number three, when it comes to the work in the temple, we find garments that are made out of linen, we find garments that have some wool. You're not going to find any polyester or cotton when it comes to the garments of the priests in the temple. Now, the Mishnah addresses the situation that you have semer gmalim v'semer rechalim shetarfan ze beze. In other words, you have a mixture here of wool. Some of the wool is from a camel, which is not technically wool. There's no prohibition of shatnez with camel's wool. But it got mixed into sheep's wool. And it got mixed together, blended together. And the question is, what are you going to consider it? Are you going to consider it camel's wool, and then it would be permissible to mix one of those fibers with linen, or perhaps it retains the status of sheep's wool? So the Mishnah tells us, Im rov min hagmalim mutar, v'im rov min harachalim asur. You follow the majority. What about if it's half and half? Mechza lemechza asur. Last line of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is trying to present a situation where you have pishtan, where you have flax mixed into a material that is similar to pishtan. They are mixed together. So the Mishnah tells us, v'chen, and so too if there's a mixture of pishtan v'hakanvos, shetarfan ze beze. If you have pishtan mixed into kanvus, so too, in other words, pishtan and kanvus are similar. Linen and canvas are similar, tells us the Mishnah. So if they are mixed together, you have to figure out if it's a majority or not. That's the end of the Mishnah. May the Mishnah indeed be a source for the neshama. Now, what exactly is this kanvus? You want to guess? Cannabis. Oh, I hear some excitement there. There's some excitement there. Cannabis. The Mishnah is talking about cannabis. Okay. Writes one of the commentators, Rabbi David ben Shlomo Abi Zimra, who was born in Spain, lived in Cairo, spent some time in Sfat, and he tells us, and he writes this in the beginning of the 16th century, that you should know, Alei HaKanbos, when it comes to the leaves of the kanbus, Ochlim oto b'Mitzrayim. They eat them in Egypt. Umeshaker, and it makes you a bit drunk, he knows. Ve'omrim, and they tell me, I don't know, they tell me, he writes, Shehu misameach, that it makes you happy. That's what he says. And then he tells us, V'yesh mekomot shosim mimenu bgadim. Hemp. There are garments that are made out of hemp. It's popular among hippies, right? And if you go to the Kensington market of today, not the Kensington market of the olden days, when you remember still stores selling kosher meat and herring, but today they sell other edibles at the Kensington market. You would find hemp, things that are made out of hemp. So this is what Rabbi David ben Shlomo tells us, that they make bgadim k'moshe osim min hapishtan, very, very similar to flax, to linen. And now we suddenly understand the Mishnah. Due to the fact that there's great similarity to this plant that produces fibers that you could make garments, the Mishnah tells us that you could have a situation where you have a mixture of pishtan and kanvos. That is what we are told in the Mishnah. Now, among the few things I do, I'm a little bit involved with a local kashrut organization known as the COR. Right? So is David, by the way. So if you have anything to say, you can turn to David. A few months ago, perhaps already a year ago, they had a discussion about a company that turned to the COR for hashgacha, for an edible product that they are making. And it was basically an oil that would be used as medical marijuana, medical weed. The question that the COR had to address was, is this something we want to get involved in? Do we want to give hashgacha to a product that the next step, meaning when it is for medical usage, obviously it's important and it's useful, no question about that, but if you're going to go ahead and label it kosher, there might be a few people who decide to use it just for fun, for recreation. What do we do in such a situation? So that's a challenging question that has to be asked. And then the general question was, what's going to be our attitude? Right? What are the rabbis going to say now that this substance is legal in this wonderful country? Right? What do we say? What do we do now? In other words, what do we tell people that this is something that is technically prohibited and the Torah prohibits it? Right? So you can have shuls, right, that go through bottles of whiskey on a weekend on a Shabbos, because how can you have, right, a Shabbos without l'chaim or two or a few more? Now we do say that the liquor does make people walk to shul and roll home, right? So the question is going to be, if we're going to go ahead and claim that there's this significant issue and concern when it comes to weed, why are we not addressing some other problems? You know, these are issues that were addressed, and then you're going to tell me that great rabbis are going to sign on it. Well, some of us still remember great rabbis of the past that used to smoke, right? Now, you could claim in the olden days they weren't aware of it, or perhaps until 1962 was healthy, and then suddenly it became not. You're going to go ahead, but these were issues that people struggled with. Now, what you have to remember is the following, that when it comes to the plant of the cannabis, there are those strains that have in it a high level of this psychoactive component that's known as the THC. And those are the ones that when you inhale it or get it into your system, you get that feeling that the Radbaz talked about. And then there are those plants that would not have an issue, and you do have the possibility, people still remember ropes being made from hemp, garments we've mentioned, there are shoes. So just some information to keep in mind. And one interesting thing, there was a few months ago, I was asked a question about a concept called a chazakah, meaning, imagine you have a situation that you have a neighbor, you had a relationship with that neighbor that you allow them to use your property. And it wasn't convenient, but it was an arrangement that was already set some time ago. The neighbor moves away, and a new neighbor comes, and the new neighbor wants to rely on the chazakah, the fact that the previous dweller was allowed to use that path, so therefore we want to continue with it. While you could argue, tell your neighbor, wait a second, I was okay with the previous one using it, but the fact that you purchased his property does not give you the legal right to just go ahead and adopt all issues that relate to my property. This is a question in halacha that I was asked a few months ago. And what was interesting to know that I found a Moroccan rabbi from the 18th century. His name was Rabbi Yaakov Berdugo. Rabbi Berdugo, it's a common name it's a great rabbinic family among the Sfaradim. And Rabbi Berdugo was dealing with such a case of people that lived in a courtyard, and one of the neighbors was involved in an industry that was not so comfortable and convenient for the other members of the courtyard, but he had chazakah. He was doing it for some time, and once he was doing it and they moved in and they accepted it, they couldn't change that reality. But then he wanted to sell his business to someone else, and the new person wanted to take over, relying on the fact that up until now the members of the courtyard gave a green light for it. So Rabbi Berdugo had to address the issue, because he tells us that what industry we were talking about was the sale of hashish, the sale of cannabis, of what we would call weed or marijuana, and he tells us that the Baalei Habatim ta'anu, and this is what he's sharing with us, that those who were dwelling in that courtyard argued, Sha'chashish gorem reach mazik latinokot, that the smell was causing problems for the children. Children shouldn't be smoking, it appears in our literature. And he notes that it causes an issue not just with the actual smoke itself, but rather the type of people that come in are mishugaim, and therefore there is a hezek gadol, there is great damage that is coming about due to the fact that those who are interested in this product are not a shtickle, but he tells us are mishugaim. They are crazy people because they have an addiction to it. So this was an issue that Rabbi Berdugo dealt with, and a very interesting tshuva, but just to share with you how these were issues that existed in the past, right? There's nothing really new. When we do talk about this modern day question, right? And this is going to come up because there's going to be an opportunity in a couple of months of now of someone to go ahead and pop into one of these stores and buy it. And what would the Jewish view of things be? So I'm going to share with you a responsa from Ramosha Feinstein. Okay, a responsa from Ramosha Feinstein. And he was asked by a group of yeshiva students if we could smoke hashish or not. Okay, hashish, weed, marijuana, cannabis, all the same. And Ramosha writes in his response that it is prohibited. It is prohibited, and he gives a list of reasons. Number one, he writes, it's mechale et haguf, it's not healthy for the body. Now, if you take that reason, by the way, right, could that apply to saturated fat? Perhaps you have to ask your doctor, right? Anything that's mechale et haguf. A pack of cigarettes, right? 2 glasses of whiskey a night. I mean, these are a bunch of good, fair questions that need to be asked, because this concept of being unhealthy, if indeed things are prohibited if they are unhealthy, so you can ask that questions. Now, he notes in addition that as good Torah Jews, we have to be involved in Torah Tefillah, and it appears, and I don't know, but it appears that after smoking one of these substances, you can have a level of difficulty with your focus in Torah and Tefillah. This is what Ramosha says. Okay, number 3. He writes that you develop a ta'ava gdola when you go ahead and develop, I'm not going to use the word addiction, but a deep desire for the product. You are basically being owned by this product. Right? My late father would always know that in Jewish tradition, we view the physical world and physical pleasures as a tool to connect to the Almighty. Right? In other words, if there's something you enjoy, and you make a bracha over it, and you are appreciative to the Almighty for this magnificent gift, a cup of coffee, it is something that is indeed magnificent. You wake up, you get your coffee, if you're one of those that actually very much need it, you turn to the Almighty and you say, thank you, I deeply appreciate it, Sha'akol Niyah B'Dvaro. So if in Jewish tradition we are told that you are supposed to enjoy the physical world, why do we find in many rabbinic statements that there's a concept that you're supposed to distance yourself from pleasure? Like, for example, we call the Nazir a Kadosh. So which one is it? And my father would explain that the question basically is if you control the chocolate or if the chocolate controls you. In other words, if indeed I enjoy chocolate, and I do if it's 70% and of high quality, and a good chocolate is something I enjoy. And when I have the opportunity to eat that chocolate and I make a bracha and I'm grateful to the Almighty, that is indeed a tool to connect to the Almighty. But if the chocolate controls me, and how could that be? Imagine I have a piece of chocolate that I bought, and then I come home and I realize that my daughter saw it there and ate it. And I get very upset because I needed that chocolate, right? So suddenly, the result is I'm not in control here, the chocolate is in control. Then it is something that I have to ask myself, perhaps I need to put the brakes on, because it is controlling me. And what Ramosh is telling us here is that if indeed this is a substance that develops within yourself a deep ta'ava, deep desire, that you need it, right? They do say that when it comes to, from the little bit I read, that there are those who argue that when it comes to cannabis, it is not addictive until you try to stop using it. Now this is something that I've heard. That it's not addictive, but when you try, they have great difficulty breaking the habit. If indeed that is the case, this is what Ramosha calls a person who's mevi atzmo. He is placing himself in a situation where he's going to have a deep desire for a substance that's not the Jewish way of doing things. Now he does that you are yeshiva students, and this is written in the early 1970s, and he writes, you're going to cause great pain to your parents as well. Right? Imagine that you send your kids to yeshiva and you find out that instead of inhaling the words of Rashi, Tosfot, and the Rambam, right, they are inhaling all kinds of substances. This is going to cause great pain. And therefore, Moshe notes this is something that should be avoided. And it's an important statement to be mindful of with the new realities. And we will wait and see in this magnificent country where it has been legalized what exactly will be occurring with these things. In the United States, after Prohibition, so you go back to Prohibition, which is taking place from 1920 to 1933, right? And Prohibition was very, very successful in developing organized crime. Right? Mission accomplished. Right? For Al Capone, this was a big, big bracha. Now, within the government itself, there were some enthusiastic individuals who were pursuing, right, those who were selling alcohol. We've discussed in the past the fact that there were rabbis that were illegally selling alcohol because they had a license to sell yain for Kiddush Havdalah and for Pesach, but it was a parnasa for some of them, and therefore they would sell it to people who were, when they walked in the door for the purchase, it was quite clear that the fellow with the cross on his necklace is not going to be using it for Kiddush Havdalah or for Pesach, but rather for enjoyment. And there are some significant stories of an inspector who records that he walked into a synagogue storage house, and there was a box that was labeled matzos. And then when he pushed the box and he heard something breaking and it started leaking and what was oozing out was a red liquid, he realized that most probably the box was not filled with matzos, but with something else, meaning that they were transporting it in a problematic way. So this was a different discussion. But nevertheless, there were some very enthusiastic members of the federal government who were pursuing those who were selling alcohol illegally. Now, come 1933, they're out of a job. They're still very passionate. So they moved on to the issue of cannabis. And they established what was known as the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And the commissioner, the first commissioner, who was known as the godfather of cannabis prohibition, was a fellow by the name of Harry Anslinger. Now, he wasn't Jewish, Baruch Hashem, he wasn't Jewish, but he was the warrior against cannabis and against hemp, and therefore there was this significant decline in the production of hemp. From that point on, in the United States and in Canada, obviously it was rebounding already for the past 20 years, and by now already, once the hemp became, the stigma of the hemp was removed, so you have this new reality that exists here. Now, The name of this lecture was Vices and Virtues in Kashrut, right? Did we cover the vices? I think we did, right? We covered the vices. So now let's talk a little bit about the virtues. Virtues in Kashrut. And when I was processing what exactly to share with you, one thought came in was foie gras. Foie gras. Now, for those of you who come between Mincha Maariv of about a month ago, we had a discussion about foie gras. And some of you might realize that I actually learned how to pronounce it. Because when I was working with it a month ago, I had great difficulty with the foie, but I did master it. It took me a whole month. And we talked about foie gras. Now, what exactly is foie gras? It is a French delicacy where they take these ducks and you give them dinner and you shove it down their necks with a pole. And what's interesting is that I watched the video. I watched the video of when they come in to feed these ducks. Something very interesting happens. When it comes to any other animal, when it comes feeding time, and the farmer comes in with the seeds or with the goods, all the animals come together to get their food. When you are in the industry of fattening up these geese, what happens is that when you come in with the food, all the animals run away. Because for them, feeding is a very traumatic event where they do not have the ability to swallow because they've never swallowed on their own. Food is just stooped down, the corn is stooped down their neck, their throat, into their stomach. And the foie gras itself, by the way, has played a significant role among Ashkenazi Jews. The Ramah talks about it. The Ramah, going back to the 16th century. And it was considered normal. When we asked the question, wait a second, is this something that's uncomfortable for the animal? It was not processed in the 16th century and before. No one mentions the fact that there might be a tsar ba'alei chaim. No one mentions it. The only time they do mention that there might be a tsar ba'alei chaim is when it comes Shabbos. And Shabbos, in general, you're not going to feed an animal, but this is an animal that if you don't feed it, it can't eat on its own. So therefore, perhaps on Shabbos you have to be lenient because of Tzar Ba'alei Chaim. So the foie gras itself is a fascinating discussion, how they talk about a lot of halachic issues, because quite often when they would shove the food down the neck, the pole itself would damage the esophagus. And if you even have a hole in the esophagus, the animal, the chicken, or in this case, the duck, the geese, would not be considered kosher. So there's a lot of halachic literature about it. There is only one producer of foie gras in the United States that's under the OU. And maybe some could tell me, is it really worth it? Not worth it. Okay. So where did you have the opportunity to taste it? France. Wow. Okay, foie gras en baguette. Now, so that was what I was thinking about talking about when it comes to a virtue, but I decided not to. That's not going to be the topic. That's not going to be the topic. So bottom line, we got to get to virtues. The two virtues we're going to talk about today. Now, this is really the main topic. Number one is what we call sensitivity to community. Number one, sensitivity to community. And again, we're talking about kashrut. Be sensitive to community. And number two, sensitivity to self. What do I mean? That's what we're going to go ahead and work on. You know, when you talk about kashrut, the most sensitive area in Jewish law relates to chicken and meat. In other words, when you go ahead and have that question about a specific hashgacha, if it is on the right level, not the right level, which is a fair question, your level of sensitivity has to develop a little bit more when you're dealing with chicken and meat, because there are more problems that could develop. This is a basic statement. Historically, chickens were simpler, meaning if the shochet had a good knife and he knew what he was doing and checked the animal properly, issues within the chicken itself were minimal. Something has changed over the past few decades. The Talmud talks about the fact that when it comes to the leg of the chicken, there's something called the Tzomet HaGidim, where many sinews, 16 sinews come together. The Talmud mentions that if there's an infection or damage to this section of the animal by its leg that has all those sinews, that chicken is not kosher. Tzomet HaGidim. Now this was a theoretical discussion because there has never been issues until a couple decades ago with this Tzomet HaGidim, with this intersection of sinews. Suddenly, people noticed, Shochtim and Bodkim, those who check the chickens, that infections and damage was suddenly occurring far more often than ever before. And the explanation given was that the chickens in the past were not as gesund and fat as they are today. In other words, if you look at the average chicken in the marketplace 70 years ago, and you look at the chicken of today, they are much larger. Now, what is it that they give to these chickens that makes them fat and thus more valuable? That was a good one. That was a good one. Hormones. Hormones. That should scare you a little bit. That's why we have fish tonight, right? The hormones are creating the situation that there is much more stress on the knees. You know, like you talk about, people talk about at times their knee replacements. So chickens have their issues with their knees as well as a result. And there's this new great discussion about the Tzomet HaGidim. Now, I was aware of the halachic issue, right? And some time ago, I was going through a responsa. Now, you know that in our tradition we have a lot of responsa, she'elot ve'tshuvot. There's a she'elot ve'tshuvot over the past 15 years that's known as she'elot ve'tshuvot b'marei bazak. In other words, in the speed of lightning. She'elot ve'tshuvot, and the name of the work itself is in the speed of lightning. What does it mean? Where does it come from? So there's this magnificent organization, magnificent institution in Yerushalayim that's called Eretz Chemda. Eretz Chemda, there's a rabbi. His name is Rabbi Carmel. Rabbi Carmel was here a few years ago, and he's a great Torah scholar. It is a religious Zionist kollel where questions are sent to them from all corners of the earth, and they started off their process of responding through faxes going back 25 years ago. And therefore their response, when historically a she'elah was sent by mail, and the response would be by mail, and you would get your tshuva a good, perhaps 4 months later, now you can get a tshuva within a day or two because it is in the speed of lightning. So therefore it's responsa in the speed of lightning. Now, a few years ago, I actually visited this institution. I spent a day there. I spent a day studying there. And I come from a different background, but I was extremely impressed with them, impressed with their attitude, with their scholarship, with humility as well. And one tshuva I'll share with you that it's not so much, I'm not sharing with you halacha, but just the idea of communal sensitivity. And in the question asked to them was, we are dealing with a situation where we shech chickens. We can start the process of checking every single Tzomet HaGidim. We can start the process of checking every single chicken for issues with the sinews in its leg or knee. But the problem is, it's going to increase the price of chickens. And many people, or there are going to be people, who are not going to be able to afford kosher chicken. Question was, do we go for a higher standard when the result is going to be that there's going to be an increase in the price? The rabbis from Eretz Chemda respond that you should know that the percentage of issue is a very small percentage. Halachically speaking, it's known as a mi'ut she'eno matzui, meaning a minority that is not frequently found, and therefore you don't have to concern yourself. You should not be stringent, because what are you going to cause? The increase in price. We have to be sensitive to keep kosher food as low as possible if we want the Jewish people to eat kosher. Now this is a response. I'm not here to share with you the halacha. I'm sharing with you the idea of communal sensitivity. That is fundamental in kashrut. And I'll share with you one other thing that relates to that idea. As Most of you know, we spent a few years in Santiago, Chile. In Santiago, Chile was a very small Jewish community at that time. There was a shochet in town, a rabbi shochet. The rabbi would shecht every 2 weeks chickens for the community. He would shecht 180 chickens, and that would be enough for the community for 2 weeks. So, meaning only 360 kosher chickens were consumed during the month. It was interesting at the time, we saw a video from Empire, and Empire at the time was shechting 180,000 chickens a day. So just a little bit of comparison. Now, when it came to the shechita of the animals, of the beef, it was a little bit more complex because they would have to go ahead and work with the slaughterhouse. And the slaughterhouse said, listen, you guys come in, you shecht animals, you reject some of them. It's not convenient to have you guys here during the day, but we'll give you a window every few weeks. And the chosen slot for the shochet was to shecht between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. That's when shechita occurred. Now at the time I was learning shechita, and the shochet said, you want to come, you're more than happy. I'll pick you up at 10:40, right? And I went with another fellow, with Rabbi Guri, and we went at times to check out the shechita. Now, it was a shechita that was clearly following traditions from the 17th and 18th century. Meaning, you read about how in Europe you needed 4 large goyim to hold down the animal. That's how it was done in Santiago, Chile. That they would have the animal coming out, the non-Jews who were chosen for the task would hold it down, the shofet would come and shecht. Supposedly one time, the oxen, these were Chilean oxen that were very in good shape, right? This was Parsha. They were from the first cows. They were from the ones that were healthy. And one of them, at one time, when the shochet was turned around, the ox was able to overpower all 4 of them, and he ran away. And he ran into the street and knocked into a car. So just to tell you the complexities that existed there. After the shechita itself, which we were learning, we learned what was known as a b'dikat pnim. Meaning, in the Talmud we are told, and this is something that makes its appearance in halachic literature over and over again, there is one area that you must check the calf or the ox to be sure it is not treif, and that is the lungs of the animal, the lungs. Because there are what they call a sircha. These are like scabs or adhesions that connect the outer part of the lung to the side of the animal. And that is what you have to check. And I had the merit of doing the checking. I'm not going to get into details of how it was done exactly. For some of you, perhaps it would not be enjoyable to hear about the fact that you roll up your sleeve and put your hand into the chest of an animal that is still warm. Now, so some of you are not enjoying it, I can tell. At the same time, if you do eat fleischiks, someone did it, okay? Someone did it. Someone with a larger head than me, because the Chilean oxen were so large that I couldn't reach the bottom. That's how big they were. But I won't give you more details. I'm sensitive, or at least to an extent. Now, shechita and sircha, a lot of literature and a lot of controversy over the years. There is one area in halacha, there's one area where according to the Ashkenazim, there's a tradition to avoid a specific sircha, and the Sephardim allow it. One area we're going to focus on. And this became an issue, this specific sircha, this specific issue, became an issue in the city of Pleven, Bulgaria. Pleven, have you been there? No, okay. So obviously not a very significant location. Pleven in Bulgaria. Have you been to Bulgaria? No. Okay. So Bulgaria was a country that had in the in the 16th century, a mix of Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Because Bulgaria, remember, it's situated north of Turkey. So there was an expansion of Turkish communities northward into Bulgaria. And at the same time, there was an expansion from Hungary, and this is especially after the Turkish Empire conquered Hungary, in the 16th century. So there was an expansion from Hungary southward into Bulgaria. And they had actually 3 communities there. They had the Ashkenazi community, the Sephardi community, and what they call the Hungarian community. 3 communities were there. And at one point, the Ashkenazim and Hungarians got along, but only at one point. Eventually, afterwards, there's a tshuva of the Ramah from the middle of the 16th century where you already see that they're not getting along as well. But this issue specifically had to do with a question that related to meat. The Sfaradim said it was fine. The Ashkenazim came in with a chumrah. So they asked a question to a young rabbi who was there, Rabbi Yosef. And they asked Rabbi Yosef, who was a rabbi in a community next door, what's the standards that should be followed? And he said the following, that you should know, said Rabbi Yosef, that the Sfaradim came there first. If you have a community and there's an accepted standard, don't walk in with new standards, not to make it more strict, not to make it more lenient, because we need Jewish unity. You cannot go ahead and start questioning others and their standards. We don't want to make machloket. The shalom is the essence of Judaism, and therefore if the community had a custom and newcomers come, newcomers have the responsibility, they have to have communal sensitivity. And that is a virtue of kashrut. This is what this Rabbi Yosef said. Now this Rabbi Yosef eventually moved to Israel. And there was a strong Sephardi kehillah in Israel. And he believed, Rabbi Yosef, his last name was Karo, Rabbi Yosef Karo, that this applies to the land of Israel as well. That if there are Sephardi practices, Ashkenazim who come in should just follow the Sephardi practices. How much we take it to halach, into practical halach or not, is a question. But the message of Jewish unity as a priority when you deal with kashrut is something I think that there could be a great benefit. So now you know, virtue number 1 was communal sensitivity. Be sensitive. If someone has a standard, God forbid for you to walk in their face and do things differently. A leniency, meaning if a community has a standard, don't walk in with your own leniencies and don't walk in with your own stringencies. Communal sensitivity. That's virtue number 1. Now, we're going to end with virtue number 2, which we call personal sensitivity. What do I mean by that? My son Moshe, who's in Israel now, studying in Yeshiva in Kerem Yavne. So he was a big Buffalo Bills fan. You know what the Buffalo Bills are? It's a football team. Right? They don't win. They don't seem to win ever. They have bad mazel. And for some reason, due to the fact Moshe is very loyal, and he was born in Buffalo, New York, so he's committed. The other kids knew how to find teams that are doing well when they were younger, and they were committed to those teams, right? So therefore, my Aaron at the time when he was younger, for him, he decided that he's going to become a fan of someone called Peyton Manning. I don't know if you ever heard of it. Peyton Manning? You did hear of Peyton Manning. So Aaron becomes a big fan of Peyton Manning, and he was such a fan that he somehow managed to even got a bar mitzvah gift. True story from Peyton Manning, an autographed photo of him. So each one, but Moshe's loyal. Moshe is not going to go ahead and jump ship. If you're born in Buffalo, you're committed to Buffalo. And therefore, as a 13-year-old, a 14-year-old, he loved the Buffalo Bills. Isaac Singer, I think you went with him once to, he went to a game, they went to a game together. Wonderful. Now, a few years ago, I mentioned to him, Moshe, there's some Buffalo Bills news. What is it? They said in the media that they're putting on new colors in their uniform. New colors in their uniform. So there is some good news from Buffalo that they are changing their uniform, they're enhancing the red and the blue. And Moshe pointed out that that's what happens when you have a team that can't really address the real issues. If you can't address the real issues, that they don't have a good quarterback, they don't have a good running back, they don't have a good defense or offense, so what do? Change the colors of your clothes. You got to do something. So you do something external. That was his point. You do something external if you can't address actual issues. Now there's great depth in it. You know, we talk often here about Ba'alei Musar. People who don't just study Musar, but become masters of Musar. This past Sunday, I was in Chicago. I went to be Menachem Oval by the family of my Rosh Hashiva. My Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Milevsky Zatzal, passed away last week. And his magnificent family are sitting Shiva in Chicago. And I went in, and his son, his oldest son, who is now the Rosh Hashiva, a person I had a very close relationship, I studied with him. And right after Shachrit Sunday morning, he got down and he spoke as a leader of a yeshiva. He spoke to the small group there, the 20 of us that were there for Shachrit in his house. And he said that, you should know, my father, this is what he told us, my father was into growth, into spiritual growth, becoming a better person. But it was not, he said, it was not that he was seeking a new chumrah. That wasn't for him growth. Growth for him was becoming a better person, working on your natural traits, identifying ones that perhaps there could be improvement. That was his essence, and it's 100% true. And I had the opportunity to mention to the son a story that when I was in yeshiva in the late 1980s, I shared this already Shabbos, but I'm going to share it again. The Rosh Hashiva's family purchased a new car. It was a Ford Taurus. Or as mentioned, if you own it for a few years, it's called a Ford Taurus, right? But they purchased the Ford Taurus, and the Rosh Hashiva read the manual. New car, we want to know how it operates. And it mentions there that this year's model, 1988, has 2,000 improvements over the model from the previous year. Rosh Hashiva gets up to the yeshiva and said the following: I read that my car improved over 1 year in 2,000 ways. If a car could improve in 2,000 areas over a year, how much is expected from a ben adam, from a mensch? That was his insight. And he meant it, talking about improvement, focus on every word. He was a person that had like a time delay when you would ask him a question, because things were not uttered unless he thought through them. And therefore every word you needed to study it, because he processed with his brilliant mind what to say, what not to say, what was needed, what was not needed. A great man, that is indeed a Baal Musar. When you go ahead and do external things, you have turned into the Buffalo Bills, and that's not good, right? You are dealing with an external change. You change your garment, you're not addressing the core issues. In Judaism, you have to address the core issues, right? And therefore, when it comes to a virtue of kashrut, it is a problem when you view astringency, right? And again, you have to study what is considered halacha, what is considered astringency. The stringency could be that problem, could be that external problem that is very far from a virtue. The virtue is actually becoming a better person. I'll end off with a statement that was made by Rav Dessler. Rav Dessler was a great thinker, passed away in the early 1950s. And whenever you talk about improvement, self-improvement, musar, he's a thinker that we have to always share. And he shares with us the following, that you should know. The way we work within ourselves, and what he calls kochot hanefesh, the strengths of the soul, the way it works, is that if you emphasize in one area, there's going to be another area that's going to suffer and be ignored. In his words, kol ha-maflig, if everyone emphasizes be'erach inyan echad, with the value and significance of one thing, it will take away, and yuktan be'inav, other things will become smaller. And therefore he notes that there's a great danger b'dikduk mitzvah achat. When you take one mitzvah and you are extremely careful with it, you better be careful. It could be dangerous because you might be ignoring something that is important. And then he says, you want to be machmir? Here he tells you where you could be machmir. Bitul Torah, when you waste time, when the yeshiva student has the opportunity to sit by the Gemara and study Gemara, that is an area where there should be stringency, and this could apply to all of us. The study of Torah, this is something that should become part of our life, right? Every person should study something every day. Bitul Torah is where there should be a chumrah. Next, Lashon Hara, speaking about others. Be strict there, be careful what you say. That is what real spiritual growth is about. he was asked by David, how are you going to tie this into Hanukkah? Well, Bet Hillel tells us on night 1 was 1, night 2 was 2, because ma'alin b'kodesh, we try to increase in our holiness. And this is really something that we have to remind ourselves, inspire ourselves, especially during Hanukkah. It's a time for growth. We grow by actually addressing real issues, right? By addressing real issues, and that is the virtue. Thank you for tuning into our Vices and Virtues. May indeed the Neshama have an aliyah. We thank you all for coming. It's nice. It's nice to have everyone come out. It's nice to be Hanukkah together. It is indeed very, very special, and it's a bracha I give you that we should have a gesunte winter. And for those of you who warm up a little bit during the winter, please have me in mind when I'm wearing my sweater here in Toronto. But indeed, let's get together with happiness, with unity, because communal unity is indeed the core of what we are about. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Rabbi Milevsky. At this time, I'd like to invite everyone to the back to partake in the dessert.